Hey everyone, this is Bathymetrics. Happy 2022. Today I'm starting a new series of much shorter, more focused videos about mixing loud and using my clip to zero technique. And this whole series effectively comprises a set of updates to my thinking about clip to zero for 2022 and beyond. I introduced this technique, a year and a half ago on YouTube. And I made some pretty long videos showing various things about it, doing walkthroughs of it. I've written a whole guide that's linked in every one of the video descriptions because for some people it's a lot easier to absorb chewy information like this in a written form. But I think it's time to, update my videos because a lot of my videos were earlier concepts and sort of still struggling how to explain it succinctly and concisely and well. And over time, I think I've gotten a little better at how to explain it. This guide is always up to date with the latest evolutions and tweaks I've made to the process. But I'm going to do a video series now that is effectively going to cover all this material. I'm going to kick them out in pretty quick succession. I can only typically do it on weekends because my job is pretty demanding. But I'm going to focus on these. They're all going to be relatively short, relatively focused. And I just wanted to give you a little preview of what's coming next on this channel. And if you're really interested in learning how to mix loud effectively, and especially how to apply my whole gainstaging philosophy that I call clip to zero, you may want to subscribe to the channel to make sure that you get notified about these videos as I put them out. I may try to do 2 or 3 each weekend, and then I'll dribble them out through the week. I don't know, it just depends on what my workload is like. So I hope that you'll find this useful. I hope that those of you that balk at the length of my 1.5 and 3-hour deep dive walkthroughs will enjoy this new format and find it a little more digestible. I'll put them all in a single playlist so they're easy to find. And, basically I'm going to just top to bottom this whole thing the way I think about it, the way that I apply clip to zero from start to finish. First couple videos will focus on why, again, just explaining why you want to gain stage in this way. And I just want to make a side note. I was really surprised and glad the other day to hear from my friend Dylan Lane, who is the artist Ill Gates. And he's been one of my great mentors as I've learned the ropes, so to speak. He called me up the other day just to tell me that he heard he was talking with Edit from the Glitch Mob, and Edit said, yeah, Bathymetrics, the clip to zero method, this is really good stuff. I'm using this to help me solve some problems I'm having with some live shows that I'm doing right now in an interesting format. And I've had tons and tons of very supportive comments. I really appreciate all of them from people who have taken the time to wrap their head around this concept and try it out. And so many people are like, oh my gosh, this just makes everything so much easier. So, it's not just working for me, it's working for a lot of you too. And I'm not really going against the grain with any of this clip to zero philosophy. It's just stuff that the good mixing engineers and good producers have been doing all along. They just never talk about it this way, and they never formalized it into a really repeatable, teachable thing. I think I'm the first person to do this, so I gave it a name. And I guess my own twist is a lot of the people who use something like clip to zero still work really low in their gain staging, like the average loudness or RMS of their tracks and buses and channels. They'll still be sitting down around -12, -10, -18 on their meters. And they're keeping plenty of headroom, even though they're clipping lots of things all across the project. They'll still keep that headroom just out of habit, or maybe because they work in a hybrid environment where they're constantly shipping signal out to analog gear and then back in from the analog gear into their DAW. And, for them, it may make sense to work at a low level. But for those of us who are home-based producers, working completely 100% in the box, there's some really strong advantages to gain staging, right up at 0, as I teach in the clip to 0 method. And there's a really repeatable, simple way to do it and control it. And there's great benefits to it. So I'll be covering that again in this first video that's coming next. And then a common question I get is like, yeah, but what about mastering engineers? What if I still send off my mixes to a mastering engineer? Is this going to mess them up? And there's an answer to that I'll cover very soon to help the naysayers understand that clip to 0 is nothing radical. It's different, but you can control it, and you can give the mastering engineer all the extra peaks and headroom they might want very easily with one button, more or less, depending on your DAW. I'll talk about the 4 main tools that are kind of central to the method. When I talk about clipping, I'm using it in a generic sense. It's not always strictly a clipper. It could be a limiter. And I've also, one of the evolutions for 2022 is introducing the concept of saturating from the bottom as well as clipping from the top. I took that as a given before, but I think it's good to spell it out that there's 2 ways to attack the dynamic range or loudness of any given track or signal. And that's by hitting it from the bottom with saturation and hitting it from the top with clipping. So, I'll be doing some very focused little videos about those 2 aspects, how to do both of them. I'll talk about what I like to think of as structured busing. You're going to have a lot more success if you have a somewhat sophisticated busing structure, like you see me using in my standard project template. I have lots of little groups that have tracks inside them. These are buses. Everything you see here is a bus. And so like these 3 buses roll up into a bus called midline. And then midline sits at the same level as my subs, vocals, drop interjects, parallel FX, and even a few other buses that I hide by default, like, well, they're kind of hidden under midline. And I have even more buses that I'll pull out later in my songwriting process for lifters, Atmos, and Foley. But everything just kind of rolls upward in this busing cascade, and all these buses sum together at a thing called tonal. All these buses sum together at a thing called drums, and then drums and tonal information are kept separate until the very last minute when they're summed together on a pre-master, not even my master track, like a pre-master, okay? So I'll be talking about this kind of busing structure in one of the earlier videos because it's an important subject. I'll be talking about what I call the clipper cascade and the concept that, lots of tiny little small clips all across your project equate to much less overall harmonic distortion than one large clip at the end, which is what happens in the traditional method where you just mix in this huge dynamic range with lots of big, tall, skinny peaks all stacking up on each other as all your sounds sum together. And then you run all that into a single mastering limiter, and that limiter does huge amounts of gain reduction on those huge spiky transients. And that's just effectively one large clip at the end. And that's much worse than doing lots of little small clips all through your project as close as possible to the source where the clipping needs to happen. It's much cleaner. I mean, this is a common thing many engineers talk about. Luca Predolesi talks about this. I've seen him mention that specifically. Plenty of good engineers use this concept, but I'll talk about it in a more formal sense. And then this is something people struggle with at first. I use a kind of mixing technique called pyramid mixing. At least that's how it was first introduced to me, where there's this notion of you pick 2 or 3 important framework sounds, and you set that framework, and you never touch it after you set it. You gain stage it at a certain level, and then every other sound you add to the project, you mix up into that framework. You level up, you fader up every new sound into that framework. And because you never touch the framework, and you know why you chose the specific gain staging you did for that framework, your whole mix just balances out into this framework. And it's a really, really powerful and simple way to mix and keep everything in perspective and not have weird creep in your overall gain levels across your project. But the whole trick to that framework is setting the anchor sound of that framework, which in the genre of music I produce, which is electronic music, especially festival-oriented bass music, maybe some hip-hop, maybe some down-tempo, maybe, stuff along those lines. And in those genres, or pop even, the kick drum is one of the most important and best anchor sounds for your framework. So I'm going to have 2 videos that talk specifically about how to set that kick anchor, where to gain stage it at, so that you'll hit the target loudness levels you want. I'll talk about how to balance the other 2 sounds in the framework, the snare and the sub, against that kick anchor, right? And now that you have a framework, I'll have another video that kind of just talks about how to pull up each sound into that framework and constantly adjust those non-framework sounds as you keep adding more sounds to your project. Then there's a trick to my method, and this is one of the reasons I use clip to 0. If you set the ceiling of your clipper cascade to just be the top of your channel, right, 0 dB full scale, if that's where you set your ceiling, it's really easy to use a simple trick that I call the VCA trick, to just take all your original source sounds and just move them as a group up or down out of the clippers that are shaving off peaks right at 0. And that's the whole power of the clip to 0 technique. It's why it's called clip to 0, because it's never arbitrary and you always have full control over how wide you let the crest factor be on your overall mix. If you pull the signal down out of the clippers that are sitting at the top at 0, you give your entire signal more crest factor, more distance between the topmost peaks and the RMS body of the sound, where the loudness is, the perceived loudness. So there's a simple trick for just like, okay, let's say I set my anchor kick a little bit too loud. I gain staged my whole mix a little bit too loud. Like I thought I was going to hit -8 LUFS by the time I was done. And I find that this particular mix and the particular EQ and sound choices that I made are really making it hit at more like -8. But I want it for some reason to be a -9 LUFS loudness, right? Well, I can use this VCA trick to literally take my entire signal and just pull it down out of the clippers, do a little bit less clipping, and bring it right down to exactly 9 LUFS, or 10 LUFS, or 11 LUFS, or 12 LUFS, right? Or you could go the other way. You could say, well, I set my mix anchor and I thought I did it right, and I would hit a target loudness of 8 LUFS. But as it turns out, when I'm done with my song, I'm really only hitting 9.5 LUFS. Well, okay, no problem. Use the VCA trick to take your entire structure and push it up a little harder into the clippers, do a little more clipping, and now you're hitting -8 LUFS. And it's just the simplest thing in the world once you understand the trick and the process. So I'll have a video that talks about that. And then we move out of things that aren't strictly the clip to 0 technique, but they're still important concepts from basic universal mixing principles and approaches that are integral and important to making a loud mix. And that is the concept of how do you give overlapping sounds that happen at the same moment on top of each other? How do you give them their own space across the spectrum, right? And then it's also important to give them their own space in the stereo field, mid to side, or left or right. And then it's also important to give every overlapping sound its own space in the front to back depth field. So I'll have 3 different videos about that. And then finally, we'll talk about, okay, what happens at the end when you've got your basic, everything up to the pre-master and master done? There's always some final 2-bus processing, some final, mix bus processing. Last little bits of EQ. Maybe you throw Golfos on there or something like that. Maybe you put a tape saturation emulator on there because you just want that final little bit of analog style saturation goodness, right? So you're going to do some things on the mix bus, and that's going to create more peaks that weren't there before. So you still need a mastering limiter to take those final peaks off. Bring everything down where you need them to sit at a ceiling value, right? But the whole trick is making sure that you're giving your mastering limiter almost nothing to do, really. I try really hard to make my mastering limiter have nothing at all to do, or very little to do. 1 dB of gain reduction at most is what I strive for. Sometimes, some projects, I don't even use a mastering limiter. Yeah, think about that, because I don't need to. So it just depends. But if you are going to use a mastering limiter because you've done some final post-processing of the whole mix on your 2-bus, there's still some considerations for how to make sure you're not making it work very hard at all, because that's when things start sounding bad-ish. If you make a mastering limiter too hard, it stops being transparent. And the whole idea of a mastering limiter is to be one of the most transparent things possible. Okay? If your mastering limiter changes the sound a lot, it's not transparent and you've done it wrong. Your mix isn't right. Okay? So it's a very important concept. I'll go over that in more detail in that video. I'm also going to spend some time on a whole video talking about why true peak limiting is bad, and you just shouldn't do it. I know this is a big argument out there right now, kind of like the loudness wars are a big argument. This whole true peak thing is nuts. It's stupid. Don't do it, and I'm going to explain why you shouldn't do it. And then finally, I think my last video will just be some general advice about which mastering limiters I like to use and why. I have a lot of them. And I have some favorites, and I have some that I think are good for other genres of music, but not for bass-heavy electronic music, even though they're in some ways very good limiters. So I'll have a final video where I talk a little bit about that. And maybe some other subjects will occur to me along the way, but this should cover most of the questions I've been getting about my last several videos about mixing for loudness, and has Dan Worrell convinced me about dynamics versus loudness. Those were pretty chewy, and I just want to kind of summarize everything, get it all in one kind of teaching playlist. Okay, hope you look forward to these. Please subscribe. Please tell your friends about this information that's coming. Turn them on to what I've got to say, and I'll see you soon.